want to explain this the right way, because I don't want it to sound like my wife's family treated me badly. They didn't. Nobody was rude to me. Nobody told me I wasn't welcome. From the time I moved to the Philippines, they invited me to meals, included me in gatherings, checked on me, and tried to make me comfortable. From the outside, it probably looked like I had everything a foreigner could hope for. I had a wife I loved. We lived close to her family. There were always people around. Someone was stopping by, bringing food, asking if we needed anything, or sitting down to talk for a while. I thought being near her family would make the move easier, and in some ways it did. But after a few months, I started feeling something I didn't know how to explain. I was always around the family. I just didn't always feel like I was part of it. At first, I told myself that was normal. I had moved to another country. I was the new person. They had known each other their entire lives, and I was the outsider walking into a family that already had its own routines, jokes, history, and way of doing things. I wasn't expecting everyone to change for me. Most of the conversations happened in a language I didn't understand, and I knew that came with living here. I didn't expect an entire room to speak English just because I was sitting there. Still, it was harder than I thought it would be. Everyone would be talking and laughing, and I would sit there trying to follow along through facial expressions and the few words I recognized. Sometimes I laughed because everyone else laughed. Sometimes I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. My wife would explain a few things, but by the time she translated one part, the conversation had already moved on to something else. After a while, I stopped asking. Not because I didn't care. I just got tired of feeling like every conversation had to stop so someone could catch me up. I also didn't want to become the foreign husband who needed constant attention. So I started pretending I was fine. When family came over, I would sit outside with everyone for a while. Then I would find some reason to go back inside. I would check my phone, watch something, do a little work, or say I needed to rest. Nobody questioned it. My wife probably thought I wanted space. The truth was, I sometimes felt less alone by myself than I did sitting in the middle of a group where I couldn't take part in the conversation. That sounds strange, but it's true. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely disconnected. And I didn't know how to bring that up without sounding ungrateful. Her family had welcomed me. They shared food with me. They helped us. They made room for me. What was I supposed to say? That it still wasn't enough? That I wanted to feel included in a different way? Even I didn't fully understand what I wanted. I think I expected belonging to happen automatically. I married my wife. I moved near her family. I showed up to the gatherings. I thought, over time, I would naturally become part of everything. But being present and feeling connected are not always the same thing. There was one gathering where it finally became clear to me how far I had pulled away. The house was crowded that day. There was food on every table, kids moving through the rooms, people talking over each other, and phones coming out for pictures. It was a normal family gathering. Nothing bad happened. That is probably why the moment affected me so much. I sat near my wife for a while, but she was busy helping with food and checking on everyone. I don't think I said more than a few words for almost an hour. Nobody was ignoring me on purpose. There wasn't some argument or rude comment I could point to. I was just sitting there, watching everything happen around me. Then everyone started getting together for a family photo. Without thinking about it, I stood up and reached for the phone. It felt natural for me to be the one taking the picture. People moved closer together. Kids were brought to the front. Everyone squeezed in. And I stood there on the other side of the camera, looking at the family I had married into. My wife noticed me after a moment and motioned for me to join them. But by then, I had already realized something. Nobody had pushed me out of the picture. I had removed myself. That stayed with me, because for months I had been wondering why I felt like an outsider. That day, I started asking myself a harder question. Was her family keeping me at a distance? Or had I slowly started keeping myself there? When I first moved to the Philippines, living close to my wife's family seemed like the smartest decision we could make. I didn't know the area well. I didn't understand how everything worked yet. Even simple things like paying bills, buying certain groceries, arranging transportation, or dealing with repairs felt more complicated than they probably were. Her family knew how to handle all of that. If we needed something, somebody usually knew where to find it. If something broke, there was always a relative who knew a person who could fix it. If I had a question, I didn't have to figure everything out alone. And for my wife, being near them mattered. She had spent most of her life surrounded by family. People didn't need formal invitations to visit. They stopped by because they were nearby. They brought food because they had made extra. They asked for help when they needed it, and they offered help without making it a big deal. That kind of closeness was new to me. At first, I really liked it. Back home, I could go days without seeing anyone outside of work. People usually called before visiting. Even family members had their own schedules and their own lives. Here, there was always movement. Some mornings, I would walk outside and find 2 or 3 relatives already sitting nearby. By lunchtime, more people might show up. In the evening, someone would stop in just to talk. It made the place feel alive. And honestly, I liked seeing my wife around her family. She was more relaxed with them. She laughed differently. She had people she could talk to without explaining every detail first. I could see why being close to them made her happy. That was one of the reasons I never wanted to complain. The first small issue was privacy. I was used to a closed door, meaning someone wanted a little space. That wasn't always how things worked here. People would call out from outside, look through an open window, or walk into the yard because that was normal for the family. Nobody was trying to disrespect me, but there were days when I just wanted to sit quietly with my wife, and suddenly we had company. At first, I laughed about it. I told myself this was part of the experience. But after it happened enough times, I started feeling like our home wasn't completely ours. I didn't bring it up right away because I knew how it might sound. I had moved near her family, and now I was bothered that her family was nearby. That didn't seem fair. So instead of talking about it, I became quieter. If people came over when I wasn't in the mood, I would go into another room. If my wife stayed outside with them, I would tell myself she was choosing them over me. Looking back, that wasn't true. She was just spending time with the people she had always spent time with. But when you're already feeling disconnected, small things start looking bigger than they are. Another thing I struggled with was how decisions happened. I might hear that we were going somewhere later that day, or that relatives were coming over, or that we were expected at a gathering. Sometimes my wife had known about it for hours. Sometimes she had only just found out herself. Plans were flexible. People adjusted as they went. I wasn't used to that. I liked knowing what the day looked like. I liked having time to prepare, even if the plan was something simple. When I found out at the last minute, I felt like I had no say. Again, nobody was trying to control me. But I started seeing every unexpected plan as another reminder that I was following a life that had already been arranged around everyone else. I didn't say much because I didn't want to become difficult. So I went along. I smiled. I showed up. And each time I stayed quiet, I became a little more resentful. That was my mistake. I thought avoiding conflict would protect my marriage. What it really did was make sure my wife had no idea there was a problem. There were also moments when I felt more like a visitor than a husband. Someone might ask my wife a question about our plans while I was sitting right beside her. A family member might discuss something involving our house or our schedule without looking at me. It wasn't because they disliked me. They were more comfortable speaking with her. She understood everything immediately. Talking through her was easier. But over time, I began feeling like she was the connection between me and everyone else. Without her beside me, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know who felt comfortable speaking English. I didn't know whether I was being too quiet or talking too much. I worried that my humor wouldn't make sense. I worried I would offend someone without realizing it. So I kept conversations simple. I asked if everyone was doing okay. I commented on the weather. I said the food was good. And after that, I usually ran out of things to say. The family probably thought I preferred being left alone. In reality, I was waiting for someone to pull me into the conversation. The problem was, they may have been waiting for me to make the effort too. That was the part I didn't understand at the time. I kept thinking I had already made the effort because I moved to the Philippines. In my mind, leaving everything familiar behind was proof that I wanted to be part of this life. But her family didn't see the things I had left behind every time they looked at me. They only saw the man sitting quietly at the edge of the group, checking his phone, disappearing into the house, and rarely asking questions. I thought I was being polite. They may have thought I wanted distance. And without anyone realizing it, we were all giving each other exactly the wrong impression. For a while, I convinced myself I could handle it without saying anything. I figured I just needed more time. Maybe I would eventually understand more of the language. Maybe the family would get used to me. Maybe I would stop feeling uncomfortable at gatherings. But instead of getting easier, I became more aware of everything. I noticed when plans were discussed without me. I noticed when everyone laughed and I had no idea why. I noticed how naturally my wife moved between conversations while I sat there waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Even small things started bothering me. If food was brought over and nobody told me who it came from, I felt left out. If relatives arrived and my wife immediately went outside, I felt forgotten. If she spent most of a gathering talking with everyone else, I wondered why I had even come. None of those things were serious on their own, but I had allowed so many small frustrations to pile up that everything started feeling personal. That is what happens when you don't talk about something early. Eventually, you're no longer reacting to what is happening in front of you. You're reacting to months of things you never dealt with. My wife noticed I was spending more time alone. She would ask if I was tired or if something was bothering me. Most of the time, I told her I was fine. I wasn't trying to lie to her. I honestly didn't know how to explain it without making her feel responsible. What could she do? Tell her family not to visit? Ask everyone to speak English whenever I was around? Spend every gathering sitting beside me so I wouldn't feel uncomfortable? I didn't want any of that. I also didn't want her to feel like she had to choose between her husband and her family. So I kept saying everything was okay. Meanwhile, I was becoming harder to be around. I would agree to go somewhere and then act irritated once we arrived. I would sit quietly and wait for her to notice I wasn't enjoying myself. If she didn't notice, I felt ignored. If she did notice and asked what was wrong, I would say nothing. Looking back, I can see how unfair that was. I expected her to understand a problem I refused to explain. There was one evening when a few relatives came over unexpectedly. It had been a long day, and I had been looking forward to spending some time alone with my wife. Within a few minutes, the yard was full of conversation. Food came out. Chairs were moved around. The evening became another family visit. I sat outside for a little while, but I wasn't really participating. Eventually, I went back inside. I could hear everyone laughing through the wall, and instead of seeing it as a normal visit, I started feeling sorry for myself. I remember thinking that my wife had a full life here, and I was just attached to the side of it. She had family, history, language, and a place where she naturally belonged. I had her, and when her attention was somewhere else, I felt like I had nothing. That wasn't healthy. It wasn't her fault either. I had built my entire sense of belonging around one person. I expected my wife to be my partner, translator, closest friend, social connection, and guide through everything. That was too much pressure to put on her, even if I never said it out loud. After everyone left, she could tell I was upset. That was the first time I admitted that I sometimes felt invisible around her family. I tried to explain that I didn't blame anyone. I just felt like I was always standing near the family instead of being inside it. The conversation was uncomfortable because she had seen the situation completely differently. From her point of view, her family had been giving me space because they thought that was what I wanted. They saw me leave gatherings early. They saw me sit with my phone. They noticed that I rarely started conversations. Some of them were nervous about speaking English around me because they were afraid of making mistakes. Others assumed I didn't enjoy the noise or the constant visitors. All that time I had been waiting for them to make me feel included, and they had been trying not to make me uncomfortable. That realization was embarrassing. I had created an entire explanation in my head. I thought maybe they saw me as temporary. Maybe I was only included because I was married to her. Maybe I would always be the foreigner sitting at the edge of the group. But I had never actually asked anyone how they felt about me. I had filled in the silence myself. And because I already felt insecure, I always chose the explanation that hurt the most. My wife also helped me understand something I had missed. Her family didn't show closeness the way I was expecting them to. I was waiting for long, personal conversations. I wanted someone to sit beside me, ask about my past, and make an obvious effort to get to know me. They were showing it in smaller ways. They saved food for me when I wasn't outside. They remembered which dishes I liked. Someone checked our house when we were away. Relatives offered rides, brought things we needed, and included me in plans even when I barely spoke once I arrived. I had noticed those things. I just hadn't counted them as connection. I was looking for belonging in a form that felt familiar to me. Because it looked different here, I almost convinced myself it wasn't there at all. That conversation didn't solve everything in one night. I still couldn't understand most of what was being said. I still needed privacy sometimes. Unexpected visits didn't suddenly become easy for me. But for the first time, I stopped asking why nobody was making an effort. I started asking whether I had made myself available enough for that effort to reach me. The first thing I changed was simple. I stopped disappearing. Not completely. I still needed quiet sometimes, and I didn't want to force myself to sit outside for hours when I was mentally exhausted. But I stopped leaving the moment I felt uncomfortable. If people came over, I stayed a little longer. I put my phone down. I listened, even when I couldn't understand everything. I started paying attention to names, relationships, and the way people interacted with each other. At first, I still felt awkward. There were long stretches where I had nothing to add. But I realized I had been treating every quiet moment like proof that I didn't belong. Sometimes a quiet moment is just a quiet moment. Nobody was studying me. Nobody was wondering why I wasn't entertaining. Most people were just living their lives. That took some pressure off. I also started asking more questions. Not deep questions, just normal things. I asked where someone had been that day. I asked about work, school, food, repairs, or whatever was happening around us. Sometimes the answer was short. Sometimes my wife helped explain part of it. But little by little, the conversations became less uncomfortable. I also started learning a few words and phrases. I'm not going to pretend I suddenly became fluent. I didn't. My pronunciation was probably terrible, and I forgot things constantly. But even using a few words changed the mood. People laughed with me instead of me sitting there wondering what everyone was laughing about. They corrected me. They repeated things slowly. Sometimes a relative would teach me a word just to see if I could remember it later. Those moments were small, but they gave us something to share. I had spent months thinking the language was a wall. Once I started making an effort, it became more like a door I had never tried to open. I also had to be honest about privacy. That part couldn't be solved by me simply trying harder. I loved that my wife was close to her family, but I still needed our home to feel like a place where we could have time together. I had to explain that without making it sound like I wanted everyone gone. The biggest change was giving my wife a chance to understand what I needed before I became irritated. If I had a long day and wanted a quiet evening, I said that. If I wasn't in the mood for a visit, I didn't sit outside looking miserable and expect her to figure it out. Sometimes I stayed inside while she spent time with everyone. The difference was that I stopped turning it into a private story about her choosing them over me. She wasn't rejecting me. She was talking with her family. Those two things were not the same. There were still moments when I felt left out. That didn't disappear. I would still sit through conversations I couldn't follow. Plans still changed without much warning. There were still gatherings where I didn't know where to stand or what I was supposed to be doing. But I became better at asking. I stopped pretending I understood everything. If I didn't know what was happening, I said so. If everyone was going somewhere, I asked what the plan was. If I needed a few minutes to get ready, I spoke up instead of silently getting frustrated. It sounds obvious now. At the time, it felt like a major change. I had spent so long trying to be easygoing that I had become impossible to read. Nobody knew when I was confused, uncomfortable, or hurt because I always acted like nothing bothered me. Then I resented everyone for not noticing. That wasn't communication. That was a test nobody knew they were taking. One of the first times I felt a real difference happened during another family meal. It wasn't a special occasion, just food, people coming and going, and more conversation than I could follow. Normally, I would have eaten quietly and gone inside. This time, I stayed. Someone made a comment and everybody laughed. I didn't understand it, so I asked what I had missed. The explanation took a while because the joke didn't translate very well. By the time I understood it, it wasn't even that funny. But everyone was laughing again because of how long it took me to get there, and I was laughing too. Not because I was pretending, because I was finally part of the moment. That was when I started understanding that connection wasn't going to arrive as one big emotional event. Nobody was going to officially announce that I belonged. It was going to happen through ordinary moments, sitting around after a meal, helping move chairs, remembering someone's name, trying a phrase and getting it wrong, being asked to hold a baby while someone fixed a plate, looking after the house when relatives were away. The kind of things that don't seem important until you realize they are how families actually become comfortable with each other. I had been waiting to feel like family before acting like family, but maybe I had it backward. Maybe the feeling came after showing up enough times that nobody had to think about whether I was included. That took patience. It also required me to stop comparing everything to what family looked like back home. This was different. Not worse, not better in every way, just different. And the more I accepted that, the less I felt like I was standing outside trying to understand it. A few months later, we had another family gathering. It was almost the same kind of scene as before. Food everywhere, kids moving around, several conversations happening at once, people arriving without much warning and finding somewhere to sit. There were still moments when I had no idea what anyone was talking about. The difference was, I wasn't sitting there keeping score anymore. I wasn't counting how many minutes had passed since someone spoke English. I wasn't watching my wife to see whether she noticed I was uncomfortable. I talked when I could. I asked questions when I needed help. When I had nothing to add, I just listened. And when I needed a break, I took one without turning it into something bigger. At some point, everyone started gathering for a picture. For a second, I had that same instinct to step away and take the phone. That was what I had always done. But before I could move, one of the relatives handed the phone to someone else and waved me toward the group. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nobody gave a speech. Nobody made a big deal about it. They just made room. I stood beside my wife while everyone crowded together, and one of the kids ended up directly in front of me, blocking half my body. The picture probably wasn't very good. A few people weren't looking at the camera. Somebody had their eyes closed. The kids couldn't stand still. But I was in it. And this time, I didn't feel like I'd been invited into someone else's family picture. It felt like a picture of all of us. I don't want to make it sound like everything became perfect after that. There are still cultural differences I don't understand. There are still days when I want more privacy than everyone else does. I still miss parts of the conversation, and I still occasionally find out about plans much later than I would prefer. My wife and I have had to keep working on that. She tries to give me more notice when she can. I try not to treat every last-minute change like a personal attack. She helps include me when the conversation matters. I also understand that she cannot spend every gathering translating every word. We meet somewhere in the middle. That has probably helped our marriage more than anything else. Before, I thought one of us had to be right. Either her family was excluding me, or I was being too sensitive. The truth was less simple. Some situations could have been handled differently. Some boundaries needed to be discussed. But I had also withdrawn so quietly that nobody understood what was happening. I wanted people to know me while making myself difficult to know. Moving to the Philippines taught me that being welcomed and feeling at home are not always the same thing. People can open their door to you, share their food, include you in their plans, and still not know what you need emotionally, especially when you never tell them. I thought marrying my wife would automatically give me a place inside her family. Legally, maybe it did, but real connection took longer. It came from staying outside a little longer instead of going back into the house. It came from asking what everyone was laughing about. It came from accepting food even when I wasn't sure what it was. It came from helping when something needed to be done instead of waiting to be invited. And it came from understanding that her family was learning how to be comfortable around me too. I wasn't the only person adjusting. For a long time I described myself as the outsider. That word made everything easier to explain. If I was the outsider, every awkward moment had a reason. Every misunderstanding proved something. Every time I felt uncomfortable, I could blame it on never truly being part of the family. But once I stopped hiding behind that idea, things began to change. Not all at once, just enough that I started noticing what had been there from the beginning. The plate of food saved for me, the relative who checked whether I needed a ride, the person who remembered what I liked from the store, the kids who no longer acted shy around me, the way people started asking where I was when I didn't come outside. Those things may not sound important. To me, they were. They meant I was no longer just the foreign husband who happened to live nearby. I had become part of the normal routine. I still stand out. I probably always will. I look different. I speak differently. I grew up with a completely different idea of privacy, schedules, and family life. Belonging didn't require those differences to disappear. It required me to stop treating every difference like evidence that I wasn't wanted. I had spent months waiting for someone to make me feel like family. What I finally understood was that they had already opened the door. I was the one standing in the doorway, unsure whether I should walk in. So if you move to the Philippines and marry into a close family, there may be days when you feel invisible. There may be conversations you cannot follow and moments when you wonder where you fit. That feeling is real. But before you decide nobody wants you there, take an honest look at what you are doing too. Are you showing up? Are you asking questions? Are you letting people see who you are? Or are you sitting quietly, waiting for everyone else to solve a problem they don't even know exists? I wish I had asked myself that much earlier. Because I wasn't pushed out of the family, I was afraid to step fully into it. And once I finally did, I realized I had not been standing outside alone. They had been waiting for me too.